Hello, it's Alan Boyd again, and this is video 2. Neocons were upset with Iraqis for not being able to govern themselves right after America destroyed their country. They blamed all the violence and problems on them, yet the same neocons will pander to blacks, saying we still have a long way to go on race in this country. They allow for blacks to use their history, going way back to account for current struggles, but think Iraqis should not blame their problems on us just because we recently destroyed their nation. Blacks allow for this to be stated without challenging it. What annoys me is the question neocons ask those against the war. Since we do not support the war, they ask if we support the troops. They do this in an attempt to manipulate us into saying something they want to hear. Many blacks refuse to say they support the men in blue. They do this because they believe the police often wrong blacks while going about their mission of policing. Blacks too often freely say they support the troops. This makes it look like they think what the troops have done in Iraq is honorable because they refuse to give the same support to police because they feel many of their actions are dishonorable. Blacks have not used their power in America in a responsible manner and called America out for the evils it has done to the powerless. I remember going to see Louis Farrakhan speak at NIU in the early 1990s. We were given a Nation of Islam magazine that had a map of the world with a snake traveling out of Europe and controlling the whole world. The snake was the white devil. That same snake is moving around the Middle East today with the help of most well-to-do African Americans. They have decided it is better to join the man and partake in the plunder than to defend the weak Iraqis. Let me explain how I became personally aware of the double standard for blacks in America. It was the spring of 1992, and I was close to turning 23 when the LA riots broke out. I was listening to an African American radio station cover the events when I was finishing my last year of college at NIU. Corporations in Chicago were sending their employees home early in case rioting started to break out across the country. The blacks on the radio were rejoicing that white people had fear in their eyes as they left and raced for the trains. They said that this happening was long overdue and that the whites deserved it. I couldn't believe they were allowed to say this. Whites weren't allowed to talk about blacks in such a hateful way. I was upset, but if I spoke my mind in public, I'd be labeled a racist. In all my years growing up in America, I never had a political viewpoint that I did not feel comfortable expressing, but now I did. Of course, it was easy for me to stomach because I was part of the more successful and more powerful majority. I remember later in the decade, 3 white teenagers hopped on a train illegally outside of Detroit to get a free ride. They got off at the wrong stop in a black neighborhood. Young black males raped the white woman and left the 2 white male teens for dead. How come there was not the same outrage by all Americans like there was for James Byrd? I had never even knew one of those victims' names, much less remembered them. Sure, neocons pretend to be outraged when black leaders do not condemn acts like these. It is all part of the double standard that exists. I wondered why when blacks complained about poor service at restaurants, why their poor tipping was not mentioned as the root cause. Struggling single mothers who work as waitresses have car and rent payments to make from their tips. There are many examples of the double standard. It is an unwritten agreement to give blacks a double standard. If you challenge it, you will be crushed. Now we see that decades before the war in Iraq began, neocons had something in place they could take away if blacks openly opposed the war. Negativity towards blacks could increase drastically if neocons stopped protecting the double standard. What was driving this double standard throughout the country? And why was it stronger in Illinois than in other states? The blacks want it and they vote for Democrats who then support it. We know that part. There has to be something among neocons for such a strong double standard to exist in favor of black people who did not have much power and money at the time of the LA riots. We need to separate the larger reason from the larger reason I'm looking at in this art. We need to separate the larger reason from the smaller reason, or the reason I am looking at in this article. The largest part that drove it is that Illinois has a very high percentage of their white population that could be labeled as upper middle class. It is easy for whites in the suburbs to allow blacks to assume huge victim status. After all, it does not hurt them. They are enjoying their money and nicer neighborhoods. I bet good money that black radio stations over in Indiana were not openly rejoicing about the LA riots like in Chicagoland. And that is partly due to a higher percentage of whites being part of the working class and not the upper middle class. They would not have put up with it. I have dealt with this issue in detail in my website, abolishpropertytaxes.com. I suggest you read it along with this article. This article focuses on the smaller piece, driving the double standard, which is blacks' support for the troops. It took me years to come to those conclusions. When I first became aware of the double standard, the small taste of powerlessness I got made me want to search for answers. I was just opening my eyes and seeing the basics or the surface of the issue. I was missing the underlying causes. After all, it seemed to me like all whites knew there was a double standard that existed. My first instinct was to blame blacks and liberals. Blacks did not have much power then, so there had to be another driving force. The problem was that the driving force oftentimes was, neocon whites, whom admitted there was a double standard and said it wasn't fair. They could go along with the double standard secretly, and if questioned why they made a comment that furthered the double standard, they could claim they were just being politically correct because they had to. And that is the end of video 2. Thanks for tuning in.